Sometimes the biggest legal mistake is the one everyone applauds. The smell of fresh asphalt drifted across my field long before the first ribbon was cut. Thick black rollers rumbled across the dry Texas soil my family had owned for generations, leaving behind a perfectly smooth road where wild grass had been growing only days before. The vibration traveled through my boots as I stood beside an old barbed wire fence with my hands resting in my jacket pockets, quietly watching an entire homeowners association celebrate what they believed was their greatest achievement. Bright balloons bounced in the morning breeze. A local photographer crouched beside the new entrance snapping pictures while children rode bicycles across pavement that still shimmered beneath the rising sun. Linda Mercer, the president of the Homeowners Association, stood in front of a decorative stone monument wearing a spotless white blazer and smiling like someone accepting an award. She held oversized ceremonial scissors while neighbors applauded around her. The scent of expensive perfume barely covered the sharp odor of hot tar and diesel fuel hanging in the air. "We finally connected the community the right way," she proudly announced as people clapped louder. I simply nodded from across the fence. A contractor noticed me standing there and gave me an awkward wave. He probably expected another argument. Instead, I lifted my coffee cup in return. That confused him even more. "My name is Nathan Brooks. I have spent most of my life measuring land instead of arguing over it. Survey stakes, boundary monuments, elevation benchmarks, and faded property maps make more sense to me than emotional speeches ever will." My father spent 30 years working alongside engineers on transportation projects across Texas, and from the time I could walk, he taught me that every piece of land tells a story if you know where to look. Most people only notice fences. He noticed survey pins hidden beneath weeds. Most people trusted rumors. He trusted recorded documents. Those lessons stayed with me long after he was gone. Standing there that morning, I could almost hear his calm voice reminding me never to interrupt someone while they are making an expensive assumption. Several neighbors glanced in my direction with satisfied smiles, clearly expecting disappointment on my face. After all, everyone in Cedar Ridge Estates believed the Homeowners Association had won. They assumed I had finally accepted defeat after months of construction equipment crossing the edge of my field. They had watched dump trucks unload gravel, bulldozers level the ground, crews install drainage pipes, and paving machines transform open pasture into a polished entrance road leading directly into their subdivision. Every stage of construction happened in plain sight. I never called the sheriff. I never blocked the equipment. I never stood in front of a machine demanding they stop. Linda interpreted my silence as surrender. The board celebrated it as cooperation. Even the contractors relaxed once they realized the quiet ranch owner was not going to interfere. What none of them understood was that silence and agreement are not the same thing. As another family drove across the fresh pavement toward the subdivision, I looked beyond the new asphalt to an old rusted survey marker barely visible beneath tall grass near the edge of the field. Everyone's attention was fixed on the road they had just built. Mine was focused on a piece of weathered steel that had been quietly waiting there for more than 50 years, because that forgotten marker knew something the celebration had not yet discovered. Most people saw nothing special about that field before the paving crews arrived. To them, it was just another stretch of open grass separating the subdivision from the state highway. To me, it was the place where my father taught me that every property line begins with a fact, not an opinion. I grew up following him across ranches, highway projects, and county parcels carrying a bright orange survey rod that always felt twice my height. While other kids spent their summers at baseball camps, I spent mine learning how to read plats spread across truck hoods and watching licensed surveyors uncover iron monuments that had been buried beneath dirt for decades. My father never rushed those moments. He would kneel beside a weathered marker, brush away loose soil with his work gloves, and remind me that steel does not lie, paper does not forget, and recorded boundaries outlive every argument. The smell of cedar after a summer rain still reminds me of those mornings because we always started work before the Texas heat settled across the fields. Long before Cedar Ridge Estates appeared on anyone's real estate brochure, our family used that pasture for grazing cattle during the spring and cutting hay in late summer. It was never the most valuable piece of the ranch, but my father insisted we maintain every fence, every drainage ditch, and every survey reference with the same care as the front pasture. He had spent nearly 3 decades working alongside engineers on transportation projects across the state, and he developed a habit of bringing home outdated highway maps that most people would have thrown away. They filled an old filing cabinet inside his workshop, each one covered with handwritten notes, dates, and tiny arrows pointing toward easements, utility corridors, and right-of-way reservations. As a teenager, I thought those maps were boring. As an adult, I realized they were a history book hiding in plain sight. After my father passed away, I inherited both the ranch and that battered gray filing cabinet. I kept everything exactly where he had left it, more out of respect than necessity. Every few months, I opened the drawers just to make sure moisture had not damaged the documents. The paper smelled faintly of dust and machine oil from years inside the workshop, and every page carried the same careful handwriting I remembered from childhood. When Cedar Ridge Estates began expanding toward my property several years earlier, I noticed contractors measuring near the edge of the pasture. They seemed confident, organized, and completely certain they knew where every boundary belonged. Linda Mercer often drove through the construction site in a spotless white sport utility vehicle, greeting workers and discussing future entrances with an enthusiasm that impressed everyone around her. She always smiled when she waved at me across the fence, as though we were both watching the same story unfold. We were not. She saw an empty field waiting to become progress. Every time I looked across that grass, I remembered my father tapping one faded map with the end of his pencil and quietly saying, "Nathan, someday someone will look at this land and only see what is on the surface. Never forget to look underneath first, because that is where the real answers usually wait." Construction officially began the first Monday in April. I remember because the steady growl of bulldozers replaced the usual sound of meadowlarks before 7 in the morning. The smell of diesel fuel drifted across the pasture as survey flags appeared one after another, followed by stacks of crushed limestone waiting beside my fence line. Linda Mercer stood in the middle of the activity wearing polished leather boots that somehow stayed spotless despite the dust swirling around everyone else. She spoke confidently with contractors while pointing across my field using rolled construction plans like a conductor leading an orchestra. Every conversation carried the same certainty. The new entrance would shorten traffic, increase property values, and modernize the neighborhood. Nobody seemed interested in asking whether every layer beneath those plans had been verified. A few of the contractors wandered over to introduce themselves. They were friendly enough, explaining that they had received complete engineering drawings and approvals through the Homeowners Association. One even apologized for the temporary noise, promising they would finish quickly. I thanked him, wished the crew a safe project, and returned to repairing a section of fence several hundred feet away. My calm reaction seemed to confuse everyone. One afternoon, my neighbor, Bill Henderson, drove his pickup onto the ranch and climbed out with concern written across his face. He stared at the excavators carving through the edge of the pasture before looking back at me. "Nathan, why are you letting them do this?" he asked. "If somebody started paving my land, I would have stopped them on day one." I leaned against the tailgate of my truck and watched another load of gravel disappear beneath a grader. "Sometimes," I answered quietly, "people reveal more by finishing a project than by starting one." Bill frowned, clearly expecting a longer explanation, but I simply changed the subject and offered him another cup of coffee from my thermos. News traveled quickly through Cedar Ridge Estates. Within days, everyone believed I had accepted the new entrance without a fight. Social media filled with photos celebrating the progress. Residents praised Linda for her leadership and thanked the Homeowners Association for creating what they called a permanent solution to neighborhood traffic. A local real estate office even advertised the improved access in one of its weekend listings. Every smiling photograph showed fresh gravel, heavy equipment, and workers making steady progress across the field. None of them noticed the old rusted survey monument standing quietly a few yards beyond the construction area, hidden behind tall grass that the machines never touched. Each evening after the crews left, I walked the perimeter alone. Fresh tire tracks crossed the ground while the scent of warm asphalt lingered long after sunset. I carried no protest signs, made no angry phone calls, and filed no emergency complaints. Instead, I stopped beside that forgotten survey marker, brushed away loose dirt with the toe of my boot, and compared its location to measurements stored in my memory since childhood. The machines kept moving forward every day. So did Linda's confidence. Watching both unfold at the same time, I realized they were building far more than a road. Without realizing it, they were carefully documenting every step of a mistake that would eventually be impossible to deny. By the end of May, the transformation looked complete. Fresh asphalt stretched across what had once been open pasture. Crisp white lane markings reflected the afternoon sun, decorative stone planters framed the entrance, and black metal light poles stood in perfect alignment along the new roadway. Every evening the lights came on exactly at sunset, casting long golden reflections across pavement that still carried the faint smell of curing asphalt after warm days. Cedar Ridge Estates celebrated as though they had built something that would last forever. Linda Mercer organized a neighborhood grand opening complete with food trucks, local musicians, and a ribbon-cutting ceremony that drew nearly every homeowner in the subdivision. Children laughed while riding bicycles across the smooth pavement. Golf carts rolled slowly through the entrance as neighbors admired the landscaping. Several real estate agents stood near the monument handing out brochures that proudly advertised improved access and enhanced community value. I parked my old pickup beside the fence line and watched quietly from across the field. More than one person noticed me, but instead of expecting another confrontation, they smiled politely, convinced I had finally accepted the inevitable. Linda eventually walked over carrying a paper cup of lemonade. The scent of fresh flowers from the entrance landscaping mixed with the sweetness of citrus as she stopped a few feet away. "I am glad you came around," she said with complete confidence. "This project turned out even better than I imagined." I looked toward the freshly paved road where families were taking photographs together beneath colorful banners. "It certainly turned out exactly as planned," I replied. She smiled, assuming we finally agreed, then returned to greet another group of residents without realizing we had just been talking about two very different plans. Over the following week, the new entrance became the busiest road in the neighborhood. Delivery trucks, school buses, landscapers, utility vehicles, and hundreds of daily commuters traveled across it from sunrise until well after dark. Security cameras recorded every vehicle entering the subdivision. The Homeowners Association proudly shared traffic statistics during board meetings, calling the project their greatest accomplishment. Local newspapers even published photographs praising community investment and modern infrastructure. Friends kept asking whether I regretted staying silent while the work was underway. One evening, Bill Henderson stopped by again and leaned against my fence watching another stream of headlights cross the pavement. "Nathan, I still cannot believe you let all of this happen," he admitted. "If it were me, I would have fought them before they poured the first truckload." I watched the last orange glow of sunset settle across the field while warm air carried the familiar scent of cut hay from the far pasture. "Sometimes," I answered quietly, "the strongest evidence is created after everyone believes the project is finished." Bill looked at me with the same puzzled expression he had worn weeks earlier, but this time I noticed something else. He stopped trying to convince me to react. Deep inside the old workshop behind my house, my father's gray filing cabinet remained exactly where it had always been. Every drawer still held maps, transportation records, and survey documents that nobody outside my family had ever bothered to read. While Cedar Ridge Estates celebrated a completed road, I found myself thinking less about the pavement and more about one particular folder I had not opened in years, because somewhere inside those aging records was a detail that had quietly waited decades for the perfect moment to matter. That evening, I finally unlocked the gray filing cabinet my father had kept organized with almost military precision. The metal drawers still squeaked the same way they had when I was 16 years old, and the familiar smell of aging paper, machine oil, and cedar dust instantly carried me back to evenings when he would spread oversized maps across the workshop table after dinner. Outside, crickets filled the quiet Texas air while the last light of the sunset slipped through the workshop windows and settled across stacks of rolled survey plats. I pulled open the bottom drawer marked state transportation records and began sorting through folders that had not been touched in years. Most contained ordinary correspondence about highway maintenance, drainage studies, and utility relocations, but near the very back sat a thick brown folder with faded block letters reading Highway Corridor Reservation. I remembered seeing it dozens of times growing up, yet I had never bothered opening it because I assumed it had nothing to do with our ranch. That assumption lasted less than 5 minutes. Inside were transportation maps dating back more than 40 years, complete with engineering notes, acquisition records, and right-of-way diagrams prepared by the state long before Cedar Ridge Estates existed. My father's handwritten notes filled the margins with dates, parcel references, and survey coordinates. One page immediately caught my attention. A highlighted corridor crossed directly through the exact section of pasture where the homeowners association had just built its new entrance. I unfolded a larger engineering plat until it covered nearly the entire workbench. The paper crackled softly beneath my hands while my flashlight illuminated every faded line and measurement. There it was. The entire construction area fell inside a permanently reserved transportation corridor administered by the state. The underlying ownership had never transferred to my family, the county, or any private developer because decades earlier the parcel had been reserved for possible future transportation expansion. My family had continued using the surface for grazing through a long-standing agricultural agreement, but permanent construction required formal approval from the state transportation agency. I sat there silently reading every page twice because even after years of surveying, the discovery felt almost unbelievable. The homeowners association had not simply paved part of my pasture. They had constructed an entrance across land subject to state control without ever obtaining authorization from the agency that actually governed every inch beneath the asphalt. Suddenly, every conversation with Linda, every construction photograph, every contractor invoice, every celebration, and every newspaper article took on an entirely different meaning. They had documented every stage of the project themselves. They had proudly published evidence that the work had been completed. Nobody had hidden anything because everyone believed they already had permission. I poured another cup of coffee, even though it was well past sunset, and carefully placed every document into chronological order beside my father's notes. The quiet ticking of the workshop clock seemed louder than usual as I realized something important. I did not need to accuse anyone of anything. I did not need to argue with the homeowners association, confront contractors, or convince skeptical neighbors. The documents were complete. The photographs already existed. The construction had already been finished. All I had to do now was send one carefully organized folder to the only office whose opinion actually mattered. The next morning, I did something that surprised even my attorney. I did not file a lawsuit. I did not send a demand letter to the homeowners association. I did not argue with Linda Mercer or post copies of the documents online. Instead, I organized everything into one carefully labeled binder exactly the way my father always prepared project files. Every section carried its own tab. Original transportation corridor maps, certified survey copies, state reservation records, construction photographs showing every stage of the paving work, public announcements from the homeowners association celebrating the completed entrance, newspaper articles praising the project, aerial images taken before and after construction. The binder grew thicker with every page, yet every document supported the same simple conclusion. The project had been completed inside a transportation corridor administered by the state without documented authorization from the agency responsible for it. Late that afternoon, I drove to the regional transportation office located about 40 miles away. The building looked ordinary from the outside, all brick walls and reflective windows, but inside everything smelled of fresh paper, coffee, and polished tile floors. I checked in at the front desk and politely asked whether someone could review historical corridor records connected to an older reservation near our ranch. Within 20 minutes, I found myself sitting across from a senior right-of-way specialist named Karen Mitchell. She listened without interrupting while I explained my family's history, my father's engineering background, and the recent construction completed beside Cedar Ridge Estates. I never accused anyone of acting maliciously. I simply slid the binder across the table and said, "I think everyone involved may have overlooked something important." She spent nearly an hour reviewing maps, plats, and transportation records while occasionally comparing parcel numbers on her computer. The only sounds in the room came from the quiet tapping of her keyboard and the soft turning of paper pages. Finally, she stopped on one particular engineering drawing, looked back at the construction photographs, and slowly nodded. "These coordinates match the reserved corridor," she said calmly. "Has anyone requested a transportation occupancy permit for this work?" I answered honestly, "Not that I have ever seen." She searched another database, checked again, then shook her head. Neither have we. There was no excitement in her voice, only professional curiosity. She thanked me for bringing complete documentation instead of rumors because, as she explained, accurate records always save everyone time. Before I left, she assured me the agency would conduct its own independent review before reaching any conclusions. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. Driving home beneath a wide Texas sky, I felt none of the satisfaction people usually expect in stories like this. Instead, I felt the quiet confidence that comes from knowing the truth no longer depended on my opinion. The evidence had moved beyond my workshop, beyond my ranch, and beyond every conversation inside the homeowners association. For the first time since the paving crews arrived, the documents were sitting on the desk of the one agency with the authority to determine exactly what had happened. Now all I had to do was wait, because patient facts usually travel much farther than emotional arguments ever will. 4 days passed without a single phone call, and that silence told me far more than an immediate response ever could have. Every morning, I followed my usual routine, feeding cattle before sunrise while the cool Texas air carried the smell of fresh grass across the pasture. Beyond the fence, traffic flowed steadily across the newly paved entrance exactly as it had since the grand opening. School buses rolled through before 7. Delivery vans followed. Homeowners waved at one another without realizing that somewhere inside a state office, engineers were comparing construction photographs to transportation corridor maps one page at a time. On the 5th morning, a white state pickup truck appeared at the entrance just after 8 o'clock. It was followed by another vehicle carrying surveying equipment, and then a third marked with the transportation agency's engineering division. Nobody rushed. Nobody raised their voice. The inspectors stepped out carrying clipboards, measuring wheels, and rolled survey drawings. Linda Mercer arrived a few minutes later in her spotless white sport utility vehicle, wearing the same confident smile I had seen throughout the construction project. She greeted the inspectors enthusiastically, clearly assuming they were there to admire the completed entrance or discuss future improvements. Standing beside my fence, I watched one engineer kneel near the old survey monument that had quietly survived every stage of construction. He brushed away loose dirt with a gloved hand before comparing the exposed marker to a set of coordinates on his tablet. Another inspector stretched a measuring tape toward the center of the new roadway while a third photographed drainage structures and utility installations. The only sounds came from passing traffic, clicking cameras, and the steady chirping of birds hidden in the cedar trees. After nearly an hour, the lead engineer requested copies of every construction permit, transportation approval, and occupancy authorization connected to the project. Linda confidently handed over a neatly organized folder prepared by the Homeowners Association. I could see her smile begin to fade as the inspectors quietly turned page after page without finding the one document they continued asking about. One engineer politely repeated the question, "Do you have the state transportation occupancy permit for work completed inside the reserve corridor?" Linda looked toward the contractor, who looked toward the project manager, who then searched another binder before slowly shaking his head. Nobody argued. Nobody even tried to invent an explanation. They simply could not produce something that had never been requested. The lead inspector thanked everyone for their cooperation, collected copies of the available records, and marked several locations with temporary survey flags before leaving. By lunchtime, the rumors had already spread through Cedar Ridge Estates. Neighbors gathered near the entrance trying to guess why state engineers had spent the morning measuring pavement instead of admiring it. Several residents walked over to my fence asking whether I knew what was happening. I answered honestly, "The state is reviewing its own records." That was all I said because anything more would have been speculation. Late that afternoon, my telephone rang. It was Karen Mitchell from the transportation office. Her voice remained calm and professional as always. She explained that the preliminary field inspection confirmed the historical transportation maps matched the current survey data and that additional administrative steps would follow. Before ending the call, she thanked me once again for preserving complete documentation because accurate records had allowed the review to move quickly. I hung up, looked across the quiet pasture toward the entrance everyone had celebrated only weeks earlier, and realized the story had finally reached the point where facts no longer needed my help. They were speaking entirely for themselves. The official letter arrived the following Tuesday in a plain white envelope with the state seal printed across the top. It did not contain dramatic language or emotional accusations. It simply outlined the agency's preliminary findings after reviewing historical transportation records, conducting a field inspection, and comparing the completed construction with the reserved corridor boundaries. As I read each page at my kitchen table, the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the open window while a light breeze carried the familiar scent of cut grass across the ranch. The conclusion was remarkably straightforward. The completed roadway had been constructed inside a transportation corridor administered by the state, and no transportation occupancy permit or written authorization had been located in the official records. Later that afternoon, another meeting was scheduled at the entrance. This time the atmosphere felt completely different. There were no balloons, no photographers, and no celebration banners. State engineers stood beside county representatives quietly reviewing maps spread across the hood of a pickup truck while homeowners gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices. Linda Mercer arrived carrying several binders that looked much thicker than the ones she had presented during the inspection, but the expressions on everyone's faces suggested they already understood what those binders could not change. The lead transportation engineer calmly explained that the agency would begin the formal administrative process required whenever construction occurred inside a reserved transportation corridor without documented approval. He emphasized that the review would focus on records, engineering requirements, and legal compliance rather than personal opinions. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued. The conversation remained professional from beginning to end, which somehow made the moment feel even more significant. One homeowner finally asked the question everyone had been quietly wondering. How did this happen? The engineer answered with surprising honesty. Sometimes projects move forward because everyone assumes someone else has already confirmed the necessary approvals. That sentence seemed to settle over the crowd like the warm Texas afternoon itself. Several board members exchanged uneasy looks before turning toward Linda. For the first time since I had met her, she appeared genuinely uncertain. She admitted the homeowners association had relied on planning documents, contractor coordination, and long-standing public assumptions without independently verifying the state transportation records. Hearing those words spoken aloud changed the mood more than any official notice ever could. Residents who had applauded the ribbon cutting only weeks earlier now realized the problem had never been the construction itself. It had been the missing verification that should have happened before the first piece of equipment entered the field. Over the next several days, temporary notices appeared near the entrance while transportation officials completed their review. Engineers documented drainage structures, pavement dimensions, and utility installations with careful precision. Every measurement reminded me of my father patiently explaining that good engineering begins with accurate information, not optimistic assumptions. Standing beside the old survey marker one quiet evening, I watched the setting sun reflect across the smooth pavement and thought about how little the field itself had actually changed. The grass still moved with the breeze beyond the shoulder of the road. The cedar trees still lined the pasture exactly as they always had. The only thing that had truly shifted was everyone's understanding of the land beneath their feet, because once the official records were finally placed beside years of confident assumptions, the facts became impossible for anyone to overlook. The final resolution took almost 2 months, which somehow felt appropriate for a mistake that had taken years to develop. During that time, the state, the county, and the homeowners association worked through every requirement exactly the way my father always believed important projects should be handled, one verified document at a time. Engineers completed additional reviews, attorneys drafted updated agreements, and transportation officials determined the proper long-term solution for the reserve corridor. The finished roadway itself was never the real problem. The problem had always been assuming permission existed without proving it first. Eventually, a formal agreement was reached that satisfied every agency involved. The Homeowners Association accepted responsibility for completing the required approvals and agreed to comply with every transportation standard governing the corridor. Future maintenance responsibilities were clearly defined, official records were updated, and every required authorization was finally placed where it belonged, inside the public record instead of inside someone's assumptions. When the administrative process concluded, the temporary notices disappeared, traffic resumed under the proper approvals, and life around Cedar Ridge Estates slowly returned to normal. A few weeks later, Linda Mercer knocked on my front door without cameras, board members, or construction plans. She stood quietly on the porch while a gentle breeze carried the smell of fresh hay across the ranch. Her confident smile had been replaced by something much more honest. She admitted she had trusted incomplete information because everyone around her believed the same story for so many years that nobody thought to question it. I appreciated the apology because it was sincere, but I also told her the lesson belonged to all of us, not just one person. Good intentions can never replace careful verification. Before she left, she looked across the pasture toward the old survey marker still standing exactly where it had always been and softly said, "I never noticed that before." I smiled because that tiny piece of weathered steel had been quietly telling the truth long before any of us started talking about it. Over the following months, several neighbors stopped by simply to ask about the history of the ranch. Instead of discussing legal disputes, we walked the fence lines together while I showed them the original monuments, drainage channels, and faded boundary references my father had taught me to respect. Many admitted they had never realized how much history could be hidden beneath an ordinary field. Standing beside the workshop one evening, I opened the gray filing cabinet one last time and carefully returned every map, survey, and handwritten note to its proper folder. The familiar scent of old paper and cedar filled the room as the drawer closed with the same quiet sound I had heard since childhood. Outside, the setting sun painted the pasture in warm shades of gold while traffic moved peacefully along the roadway beyond the fence. Nothing about the landscape looked dramatic anymore, and perhaps that was the greatest ending I could have hoped for. The field remained exactly what it had always been, a place where patient facts quietly waited beneath the surface until someone finally took the time to uncover them. My father used to tell me that the strongest boundaries are not built with concrete or steel. They are built with truth that has been carefully recorded and faithfully preserved. Looking across that familiar stretch of Texas ground, I realized he had been right all along. Justice does not need to arrive with sirens or speeches. Sometimes it arrives inside an old filing cabinet, carried by faded maps, careful records, and the simple patience to let the truth speak for itself.